Hi, I'm Angela Hood. I'm the founder and CEO of This Way Global, and you are here joining us at Diversity Cafe. Diversity Cafe was founded on the fact that during COVID, people were not getting together in cafes any longer. Unfortunately, we're all having to stay huddled up in our home. And what we realized is there was conversations that needed to be had that were not being had. And so we started inviting guests on. And our guest today is Natalie Egan. Thank you so much for joining us. You are a fascinating individual with a fascinating, I will say, history. And I would say the most unique thing about you is your willingness to talk openly about it and help the rest of us figure things out. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Angela. Hi, everyone. My name is Natalie Egan. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I'm the CEO and founder of Translator, Inc., where we build diversity, equity, inclusion, training and analytics software for corporations, schools, and nonprofits. I can tell you more about that later if it comes up. But I'm excited to be here and share more of my background and my story, and just appreciate the opportunity to represent, Angela. So thank you.
All right, awesome. So great to have you. I learned about your story through a colleague of mine who read a feature story in Elle magazine. And if you can tell us a little bit about when that was out, and then what was the response to the story, and then we'll talk about the highlights from that.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm just, first of all, the Elle article was probably the biggest sort of platform that our story had been told on. There's some organic, PR hits and people that have told our story prior, but I never really, just to be honest, I never really liked it. Like, I don't like reading about what people write. And actually, it was one of the first articles that I really thought was like, wow, they really did a good job. So I'm happy that that's how we got connected. That story came out about 6 months ago at this point. It was a full feature. It was in print too, which was pretty cool. And it was like top recommended readings for Apple News. So Apple News is really what caused the distribution of that to go far beyond the reach of the traditional Elle reader. So it was getting into the hands of all kinds of folks. Really, so that was really cool. It got us a lot of this exposure, and I can tell you more about some of what that exposure is leading to. But yeah, I mean, it's an in-depth story of my life. It's kind of, the title of the article is called Corporate Transition. And I love just when I first saw the title, when it finally went to print, I was like, oh, that's like a cool title. Because it really is telling the story of, a tech CEO, a tech startup CEO, that very publicly transitioned their gender. That's me, by the way. But and sort of all of the things that went with that, and just to kind of give you all some background, I'm a serial entrepreneur. This is my second major venture capital backed HR tech, what I call change management software business. And I had another company prior to this, and it was prior to my transition. And so I have sort of a unique perspective, on gender and power dynamics in the workplace, in particular, probably from like a leadership, like CEO perspective, because not a lot of folks have done that. There's plenty of transgender entrepreneurs out there, and there's a handful of us at very, very senior levels, like Martine Rothblatt. But all of our experiences, there's so few of us that all of our experiences are so different. And there's only about 10 of us, as far as we know, that are running venture capital backed tech businesses, which is an industry.
Well, so let me interrupt you for real quick, because I don't think there's a number that most people know. So less than 3% of venture capital goes to women.
Right.
So the fact that
as low as 2%, like that number sounds really high to me, because I think number 2%. I'm like, wow, it's gone up by a third.
Right. No, it hasn't really gone up. It's just that they count if there's a female in the leadership team. They're trying to get those numbers to go up higher, right? So you're super unique in the fact is a woman CEO of a tech company that you're leading and you're VC backed. That is unusual in itself. Yeah. But the fact that you have also had the experience in that same type of role as a man is just mind blowing. Right.
Yeah. I was never actually a man, but I was presenting to the world as a man. But yeah. I mean, yes. There's the numbers get smaller and smaller. That there's a handful of us, that are out trans venture backed. There's, as far as we know, there's about 10 of us. We actually created a support group for each other. So like whenever a new one of us like comes out, like we kind of join the group. And again, there's a difference I want to call out, be very specific. Like I'm talking venture capital backed, right? There's hundreds, thousands of trans entrepreneurs out there that are CEOs running businesses, but raising institutional venture capital in a high-tech environment. There's just very few of us, and even less of us that have done it on both sides. There's a handful of us that came out as trans and then started our first business. But yeah, there's very few of us, and and there's going to be more and more. I mean, like a couple of years ago, there was even less. And so there's sort of, I mean, as you've seen in the magazines, like the trans revolution is on, and so we're coming out, and we're not just CEOs. Like obviously, we're at all levels of business, right? Like we're customer service front end, we're retail, we're VPs, we're all over the place. Trans people are everywhere. It's just we were hiding forever, or we were so deeply repressed that we didn't even know who we were, which was a little bit more like me. Like I didn't know.
So what would you say if a person is listening to this and they are leadership or they're in recruitment at a large organization, small organization, really doesn't matter what size, but an employee comes to them and says, just letting you know, I'm going to be transitioning and I'm going to make this public. What do they say and what things can they do to help support that person? Because I'm sure that is a very difficult moment in their life, in their professional life, to be able to say that. I think most people want to be supportive. So what do you say? And what questions do you ask? And what are the things you're not supposed to ask? Maybe start with that one, because I think that's what we're most fearful of.
Yeah. I mean, so fortunately the answer to that, is pretty simple, right? You say congratulations, right? Like it's literally a somebody comes out to you, in the LGBT community, regardless of whether it's trans or lesbian or bi or pan or asexual, like whatever it is that they're disclosing to you, as part of a coming out, like the first thing you say is congratulations. The second thing you could say is, how can I support you, right? How can I help you? And really put yourself into a position of listening, right? Like that's the posture that you should take is, it's like, I'm going to listen to this person and tell me what they need and just, not necessarily lead them anywhere except for that, like, hey, how can I help you kind of moment. And ultimately, you want to, provide a support system for them longer term. If this is your first trans employee or maybe your fifth, always revisiting that process or starting that, what does that look like in your organization, it's really, really important so that you're kind of ready for it, or getting better at it. I've seen a lot of my friends were the first at their companies, right?
So they were the first to transition is what you mean.
And it would break the HR system, they didn't know what to do. Fortunately, there's more and more, kind of playbooks out there now. There's known best practices at this point, but 5-10 years ago, no one knew what to do. And so fortunately, we're getting a little bit better. Systems are becoming more flexible, not just in the employment space, but in healthcare, right? The ability for me to change my name and gender marker with, Pennsylvania State Department of Transportation was pretty easy, actually, relatively speaking. I mean, I just brought in a form and they changed it right on the spot without asking questions, and it was amazing. But not that long ago, that was really hard. Same thing in the workplace. I know stories where they had to fire the employee and rehire the new employee under the new name because the HR system couldn't handle the change.
So we actually know this to be one of the questions that we asked from our audience. We said, what would you like for me to ask? And they said, we just had to go through this. This company had to fire a very well-respected employee and rehire them completely. Yeah. And then the system didn't want to take them because they were at the same address as a person that was just fired. So they said, no, that can't happen. Right.
And then it gets really messed up because then you get into insurance and like all this very complex newness to this. But I think getting ready for it is really important because, kind of go back to the numbers or bring up numbers, right? So traditionally, like old school, like, if you rewind back like maybe 10 years ago, the historically accepted numbers was like the more like kind of credentialed research said that like about 1% of the population is transgender. And that was like 10 years ago. Yeah, that was totally global. That was like 10 years ago. That was the statement. About 1% of the population. Right. And even that number is big, but everyone, especially in the trans community, was like, that number is way underreported. Like they don't understand. Like the polling that they did was completely flawed. They were basically polling out transgender people, adults only. So it wasn't including younger generations at all, which, by the way, where the younger generations are the ones that are coming out in droves right now. But it was also only for people that were out, and the amount of repression and oppression that the trans community is experiencing, like people weren't out. Like if you had asked me 10 years ago, I would have been like if you asked me that on like some sort of poll, I would be like, no. And it wasn't because I wasn't being honest. It's because I didn't know. I literally actually didn't know. I repressed my identity so deeply that I didn't even know what it was. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what it was. I, lived my life according to what everybody else wanted me to be. Like from the very core of my, identity and existence as a child, I never had my own identity. So I became what everybody else wanted me to be. And, over time that evolved, but I would have had no clue that I was a transgender woman. There were clues. Now that I look back on it, I'm like, oh, that's what that was. Like these little sort of very, at the time, what I considered very strange things about me, like almost like that I considered like a sickness at the time, because I was like, I don't understand why I want to wear women's clothes.
All right. So this is the example that you think in your mind. It's like, I am drawn to women's clothes.
I don't understand it.
What age was that? Do you remember when you first remember?
The earliest ages, right? Okay. Like age 5, there's this like a story that I used to tell quite a bit. Actually, I haven't told it in a while, but at age 5, I snuck into my mom's big walk-in closet, and I didn't know why. I was like compelled to go in there. Like I was like, I have to go in here and try on my mom's clothes. And like, I was scared to death. And like, I thought I sort of like, it was just me and my mom in the house. I have 2 older brothers and a younger sister.
Okay. So you do have sister? Yes.
Younger sister. Unfortunately, she's like, I'm like 5'10", she's like 5'3", so I could never wear her clothes, which was really frustrating. But and she was also never very girly, which was even more frustrating. But I remember sneaking into my mom's closet, and I like put on like we used to call them slips.
Yeah.
On this to me it looked like a blouse or dress because I was like years old. But it was really silky, and and then I pulled on these like thigh high like pantyhose type things and kind of stepped into a pair of her shoes. And I remember looking in the mirror and going like, I feel beautiful. Like I felt pretty. It was like this amazing feeling, but my heart was racing, and I was like, I'm not supposed to be in here. And what if I get caught? And of course my mom opens the door, and there I am. And she, by the way, doesn't even remember this, but I remember it. And like my heart almost stopped. Like I almost, I remember in that moment, like being so scared, like it was like my little life, my 5-year-old life was like flashing in front of my eyes. I was like, oh my God, like what if my dad finds out? What if my brothers find out? Like, and I remember making a promise to myself at that moment that I would never, ever, ever do anything like that ever again, because I was supposed to be a boy.
At the age of 5, though.
At the age of 5. And
Right.
so, and then I really struggled with that, like, for the rest, really until I was 38. I just, every once in a while, I would like have to put on women's clothes just for the satisfaction of doing it. And then I would basically like rip them off and throw them away and feel ashamed. And you wouldn't believe how many clothes I've thrown away. Like, it's sad.
Well, so for like things like Halloween or parties or whatever, would you, you would not dress like a woman?
No, because I didn't want people to know.
Because you felt like it would be revealing something.
Yeah. People would be like, you people enjoy this, like, really too much. Actually, I hated Halloween. I never I used to like, for Halloween, my Halloween costume for like a lot of years was a T-shirt that said this is my Halloween costume.
Okay, interesting.
So
you had this moment where you could be.
Like 4 years ago. I mean, I've been out since 2016, so so 6 years ago. But 4 years ago, I went to my first real Halloween party and like really did it up. And I dressed as Catwoman. It was like one of the most fun nights of my life.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, come on, all of us want to dress like Catwoman.
I mean,
she is pretty cool. So, all right. So you're 5 and you're kind of, you have an awakening a bit in your brain at least. And then college happens. Anything there where you're like, oh, this was another moment?
Yeah. I mean, all through, high school and college and in my early professional years, I would say I struggled. I mean, there was times I struggled more than others. I think, and there was times where I would repress it more than others. I think in college, I probably repressed it the most because I joined fraternities and like, it was in that sort of like frat culture, which is part of the mechanism I was trying to use to repress my identity. And I'm trying to become like these other people. But I also turned to like drugs and alcohol to like disconnect myself from, what I was experiencing in my day-to-day, which again, I didn't know what it was. I didn't have a name for it. I just knew that I was pretty miserable unless I was like high or drunk. And that, and it wasn't like, really serious drugs or anything like that, but it was enough to disconnect me,
right,
and sort of keep me buzzed and not thinking about who I was supposed to be. But when I was, when I got older, like when I started working professionally, and then ultimately when I started my own business, I think I sort of freed myself up from a lot of the constructs of expectations of what people, wanted of me. So I think I started to explore a little bit more. And I used to have to travel to New York City, and I actually like hated it because I knew when I went to New York City and spent the night in New York City that like this, and for people that are just listening, I'm pointing to myself, this would come out, inevitably at some point in the night, because it was like, oh, I'm in this big city. It's like anonymous. Nobody knows me. I can go into this like, Dwayne Reed pharmacy and like buy red nail polish and go back to my hotel room and like paint my nails.
And did that feel like an incredible vacation for you? Like, were you?
Yeah, until the next morning.
You were.
Yeah. I mean, it was an amazing release. And then the next morning I would wake up and feel ashamed and feel regret. And I was usually pretty hungover too. And I was always worried that like somebody would see like a little bit of the red nail, like chip on my nail, or like a little bit of glitter on my eyes, and be like, were you wearing mascara last night? And I was always ready with the story. Like if something happened, like or even if I was at the farm, if I went into the pharmacy or whatever, and I was buying the nail polish, like what if I bumped into somebody I knew? Well, then I'd have to have a story ready. So if you think about the mental load that this is all taking for me, I'm trying to use me as a way to then think about and magnify that times your workforce, right? Like all of these employees that are potentially repressing their identity. By the way, I didn't finish that thought. So 1% was the number, and it's been revised upwards significantly. So the new number that people generally accept is about 3%. I will tell you as a member of the community, it's about 5%. 5%.
So a company, so I want everyone to really think about this. So a company should be looking at their workforce and saying right now you probably know about 1%, or maybe you don't even know about 1%. Maybe
you know about the 1%.
Living a different life on the weekend or whatever. But truthfully, you're looking at 3 to 5% of your workforce is specifically in transition of some phase or contemplating transition. What does that percentage represent?
So somewhere on the gender, like non-conforming, non-binary continuum.
Okay.
So it's not necessarily people transitioning from A to B, but it's people that, you know, are really, the term would be like, from a DEI perspective, would be like covering, right? They're covering parts of their identity when they show up to the workplace. And like you said, when they get home, they switch it up. They become somebody else, right? Like the number of people that we would think of as very feminine women that show up to the workplace and follow the sort of the conforming like standards, then go home and like, you know, put their hair up in a baseball cap and like put on jeans and a white t-shirt and like drink beers and watch baseball. Like the numbers are very high. Like you don't understand it. And they may not want to transition, but they're much more masculine than we give them credit for. And they might, if they were given a choice, you know, if you really, all things equal, they might use different pronouns. They might show up to work very differently. They might completely cut off all their hair and not wear any makeup at all, and maybe prefer to go by a different name, but they don't necessarily, like, you know, they might like choose a name that's more neutral than, you know, just something that might be very feminine. So those numbers are very large. Incoming freshmen, like colleges are reporting, college and universities are reporting upwards of like 7% of their incoming freshman classes are somewhere on that gender nonconforming continuum, you know, gender fluid, gender non-binary, asexual, you know, there's a whole continuum, right? And again, they're not always like transitioning neatly from A to B. They're sort of like, you know, they're using they, them pronouns. So if you think about that number, the magnitude of that number, you just assume that some percentage of your employees are somewhere in there. They may either know it or not. They might be struggling. They may not be even there yet. You know, you need to start thinking about policies, programs, benefits, you know, because a lot of times it's not just your employees, it's the families of your employees, right? People are making decisions now about where they work, you know, for their loved one who is potentially transitioning or non-conforming, you know, and it has everything to do with culture. It's just as simple as like, well, like, could I put a picture of my child, you know, not necessarily my son or my daughter, but my child here, and, you know, tell people about them, right? Intentionally using they, them there, that's about them. Like, can I even just talk about that, let alone can I have the, you know, the policies, the insurance in place for me to be able to cover the healthcare related costs of anything that's going on for them, their partner, their loved ones, you know. So that's really important. That's table stakes these days. And, you know, and then we also get into like all the nuanced stuff, bathrooms and you know, pronouns and things like that.
The inclusion and belonging part, I think, has had some more emphasis on it. And what you're describing to me is a great example of it. You know, if I have someone that's in my family, or if I'm experiencing something like this, I want to be able to go to the company picnic and introduce this family member and have them be well received, and not have, I don't understand what you're talking about. And so how do companies become educated properly? Because I do think that there is information, you know, people go to the internet and they think that the information that they find is always accurate, but a lot of times that information is not truly empathetic. That information may have been produced by someone that doesn't really know, hasn't experienced it, doesn't know the nuances of it. So what does a company do if they want to educate their workforce as we as a society transition?
Yeah. Thank you for asking that. And, you know, sometimes it's everything you just described, or it might be dated, right? Some of the stuff gets dated, and I love, you know, we as a society are transitioning. Like, you know, we as human beings are always in transition. Like, I would tell you, if you're not in transition, like you're probably already dead, right? So we're always in some sort of transition, some of us more than others. And I think there's a correlation between like happiness and fulfillment and like being able to transition with the times and not hold on to the past and, the way things used to be, because that was easier, or it's what you put up with. The number of, really unhappy parents that I talk to that are like really fighting against their child's transition is because they couldn't be who they wanted to be. Right? Like they had to be what their parents expected them to be. And so to break that construct it's hard for them as parents. I get that. I have empathy for it, but it's like, okay, we have to transition. So, my transition is a transition for you, right? My transition was a transition for my family. And so yeah, I mean, I think to get to the question, there is a lot of information out there. It's a good place to start, the internet, for sure. But it's not going to solve all your problems. And I think, there's great resources out there on social media in particular. Like there's like thought leaders in the space that are, helping, just create representation, telling their stories, like the same way we are right now. Like this is a form of social media in a way. And, we've created a platform and we're creating representation. We're sharing the story. So, you gotta participate though. Like you have to actually be part of the conversation. So, I would say your participation matters, right? So I would say, get involved, lean in, like, even if this is uncomfortable for you. Like actually, I've sort of taken a stance that's been part of my transition and evolution as a manager, right? That like when things make me uncomfortable, like lean in to them. Like don't lean out, like lean in, like ask, why does this make me uncomfortable? Examine it, right? Like that's an indicator that there's something new here that you don't necessarily know about. So I would say like lean into this, even if you don't think you have any transgender employees or non-conforming employees, because you probably do. And this is the kind of thing that, you want to get ahead of, like both from a employer perspective, but also like managing like customers, right? Like all the constituencies, partners, vendors, suppliers, the whole ecosystem, right? So you kind of have to get up to date on it. There's an imperative there. But yeah, social media and the general internet are great places to start. And a lot of the principles that I talk about for allyship are a little bit actually pretty universal, right? Like, what applies to the trans community applies more broadly to the LGBT community, which applies more broadly to, black, brown, like, different races, just for, all the different the dimensions of diversity, let's put it that way.
Right.
So, but I would say, first and foremost, like inside your organization, besides participating and getting involved, like, create representation, right? And that's like both at the micro level and the macro level. So like in a meeting or on a team, like with a group of decision makers, like, do you have representation of different diverse experiences and backgrounds? Right? Or does everybody look the same? Does everybody sound the same? Does everybody always agree? Did everybody all come from the same college? Like that lack of diversity there is hurting your organization. Right? There's tons of studies out there. I don't need to convince you on it, but like McKinsey, Mercer, PwC, like you name it, like diversity wins, right? Like from a business perspective.
It drives ROI. Absolutely.
I mean, and the reason is because while it's slower, like there's also documentation, like diverse teams move slower, but they make better decisions. Right. And it's slower to build a diverse team. Like it's easy to recruit from your network where everybody looks like you, right? Like that's easy. It's hard to find people that don't look like you and connect to those different networks and bring them onto the team and give them a voice, right? So it's not just having them there, but it's having them actually be able to speak up in your culture. But I would say representation matters. And that representation is going to bring diverse experiences and stories and start to change culture and help create more allyship, especially for the trans community. I always tell people, if you want to hire, a unique, somebody who thinks differently, like hire a trans person, right? Like, like we think differently by default.
So I want to switch to a different topic, something that you told me the first time we ever talked,
okay,
that made my brain stop for a moment. Okay. So I'm a female founder, CEO, VC backed, right? And I have my own particular things that I think about when I'm entering into a VC conversation or the boardroom or whatever. And you said something to me that I was like, wait, what? So I've always known that people respond to men and women differently. That, I mean, that's a no-brainer. We all know this. But something you said to me, and I want you to explain the background on it and then explain what you learned, is you talked about the space that you took up after you transitioned and how it was different than before you transitioned. Because it wasn't someone did something to you, it was what you started to do. And that was the part I was like, what is happening? So if you could share that, because I think this would actually help men and women, regardless of where they are in trying to understand transitioning, but also just being men and women just in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say, and just being people in the world, right? Just like that, that's a little nuance of, it's just about being human. So I think if I remember that, I don't remember the conversation per se, but I remember these topics, so hopefully guide me if I say the wrong thing. But, I think prior to my transition, like I used to take up a lot of space, like intentionally, and I don't think it was like super, like I made a decision to do this, but it was like this subconscious thing that I was like, I'm just going to like, just take up as much space as possible. Like an example would be like, if I was sitting at my desk in my office or in like the boardroom, which was like a long conference room, like I would, be in this like big reclining chair and I would basically lean all the way back and I'd put my feet up on the table with my shoes on, probably sometimes with my shoes off, like almost like in the face of the person right next to me. Like, really off-putting, but like really kind of traditionally, like if you walked into that room, you'd be like, this person is running the room, like they're kind of controlling the room. And so I was always sort of in that position, like, of taking up a lot of space, with my voice, which is still a problem for me because I still have a very masculine voice. If you could hear my real voice, I'd sound a lot different. Like if I could really, I would be like, it would feel tiny, right? Like it would be like this, like sweet, chirpy, like sing-songy thing. But I can't do that right now. I can't focus on that. But yeah. So that's sort of part of the transition. So when I transitioned, I found myself not wanting to take up space, like wanting to be small, and wanting to not be, not cause any commotion. And I used to go into restaurants and order food off the menu, and like just because I just wanted to be in control, I would manipulate the menu. Like I would tell the waiter to do X, Y, and Z, and they'd say, "Oh no, the chef won't do that." I'd say, "Well, go ask them anyways. Like just go ask them." Because I wanted to control the things, and I didn't mind disturbing everything. Now I don't want to disturb anything. It's like I want to be like quiet in the background. And so the example of that I use is, and I had read Sheryl Sandberg's, like at least the passage in her book about like women not taking a seat at the table or not having a seat at the table. But part of it was that they weren't taking the seat at the table. And I remember thinking to myself, well, that's bullshit, right? Because like, that women should just take that seat at the table. If they want to sit at the table, they should sit at the table. What I didn't realize is that there was like all this other stuff happening, both like in terms of the environment that I'm in, but like, which would be like systems oppressing me and not wanting me at the table. But at the same time, like part of like who I was from a like chemical perspective, the chemistry of Natalie was changing. And I didn't want to sit. It's not that I didn't want to sit at the table. It's just, I didn't want to be inconvenient. Right. So I remember one time right after I transitioned, we were having a board meeting, and, like there was a limited number of seats in the room, and I was like, I'm going to stand until everybody else sits, and then I'll watch and everybody else will sit down, and then if there's a seat, then I'll sit. And of course all the seats got taken up, and I was like, well, I'm just going to stand, and not sit. when I could have easily walked into the room next door, the conference room next door, and like gotten a seat
Right.
and brought it in and pulled it up at the table because there was room for me, but I didn't want to disrupt the meeting. Right. And so it was, and I remember leaving that going like, whoa, that was weird and different. Like, why is this happening? And I started to realize like, A, there's a lot of systems at play. There's like a lot of like what expectations of what a woman or a female identified person would be supposed to do. And then at the same time, like I was like, wow, I think the estrogen is changing me a lot. Like I think the testosterone that used to be pumping through my veins was kind of positioning me a certain way. And now the estrogen is changing that. And I think that's one of the things we don't talk about very much. Like we act as if we're all equal. Like that's the equality conversation is everyone's created equal. Well, we're not. Right. And then if we're not, then you can't treat everybody equal because that's providing access to certain people that, have the natural resources to be able to accomplish whatever that is, where somebody else might not be able to. And, estrogen and testosterone play a role in that. And when I talk about this, I try to be careful in the sense that like, I'm not trying to make blanket statements like, because many women are very masculine and they have a lot of estrogen in them, and vice versa. They have testosterone in them, but they're very feminine. But there is a difference at a high level. There's something happening chemically that changes our behaviors, who we are. And, I am a very different leader today than I was prior to my transition. And, there's a lot in that conversation, but at the core, I'm a very different person. And a lot of it's, the lessons I've learned along the way and just becoming more aware of my surroundings and things like that. But a lot of it is estrogen as well. And so I lead with a more traditionally what we might call classic, like female style of leadership. And people will ask me and say, well, which one is better? And I don't think one thing is better than the other. Like, I don't think like, what I used to sort of practice as toxic masculinity is a good leadership style at all. But there are some attributes that more traditionally masculine people bring to the table versus more feminine people. Like one is more nurturing and one is more like, like hunting and, killing or what, I'm kind of joking, but like, there's very different attributes on both sides of the table. And what I believe is that, the best leaders, the best companies will bring out the best of their people and get them to work together to create the best outcomes. And that just is like diversity across all the dimensions, right? So how do we work together to take advantage of what Natalie brings to the table and what, Josh brings to the table? He's my co-founder, very different than me, right?
Okay.
He's very unemotional. Right. To a fault. I'm very emotional, probably to a fault. Like I don't want to say I'm too emotional and I've been told that I'm too emotional, but I'm like, look, this business is driven off of emotion. Like that's why we're going to be successful. So you can't take that out of the equation, but sometimes I'm too emotional, right? Like I need a counterbalance to that. So, how can we support the things that Natalie is naturally like not as good at, like I used to have no problem telling people what I needed or wanted. Like I would tell people, I want you to do this. Right. I need you to do this. You will do this. And I struggle to even say those words now, like to my team. I have trouble saying like, I want you to do this. Like, or I need you to do this. Like I like sort of stumble over my words. And I'm like, I almost feel like I have to like somehow get them to figure out that they should be doing it themselves, like almost like lead them to it and show them, like if I do it in front of them, like maybe they'll be like, oh, they should be doing that. And so, it's a very different, very, very different.
How long before you started noticing, you start the transition? So how long did it take before you were like, wait a second, I see these kind of changes happening? Was it
2 weeks?
Huh?
2 weeks.
Oh, 2 weeks. I think you said 10 minutes. I was like, that's fast. Right, so 2 weeks. Yeah. So pretty immediate.
Yeah. And, there's a lot of talk in the trans community about like, why and when and how, and, we're all part of like this big sort of experiment of trying to figure out, there's not a lot of history to this stuff. So,
right.
And the medicine is not very advanced, relatively speaking. But we are saving people's lives. That is important.
Yeah.
But I figured out I was transgender in fall of 2015, Like I figured it out. I came out as transgender to the world in like May of 2016. But I started hormones on my birthday, February 28th of 2016. So just a few months before I came out publicly.
Okay.
So I discovered it in like fall of 2015, went through my sort of like, oh my God, how am I going to deal with this? Like, psychologically, like, trying to figure out like, and then started hormones on February 28th on my birthday, which was a really cool, like rebirth for me. And 2 weeks later, I was like, oh my gosh, like this is a whole new world. Like I remember, and I know we're probably almost at time, but I was the first indicator that my life, that something was different. I was driving, it was night. I was driving on this like back country road going home. And I looked over to my left, the sun was sort of setting, and there was a deer out in the field. And I remember looking at that deer and going like, oh my God, like I have this like connection to this deer. Like I felt like we are both of this earth. Like we are both alive. And like, it was the weirdest, like, it was like this connection moment that I just was like with an animal way in the distance. And I was like, I snapped to, I was like, whoa, what was that? And then I didn't know what it was at the moment, but then I started to realize, and I thought about it. I was like, wow, that's weird, because I used to always think of deer as like a nuisance, like potentially like a hazard in the road, or like a means to an end. Like I would kill that deer to eat it. Like that's how I used to think of this. So that was a weird moment for me. And then there was a couple things later that I just realized. I mean, I just remember the first time this is sort of more personal story, but my sexual orientation started to change. And I remember sort of like this moment where I just remember looking at a man and just being like, wow, like I'm sort of to do this person. And that's a whole nother conversation, but like that was like 2 weeks after I started the hormones. And it wasn't switching my sexual orientation. It was unlocking who I really was. I used to be obsessed with women. Turns out I just wanted to be a woman. And I had repressed my attraction to men because it was like one layer lower in the priority of like my gender.
Right.
So anyways, that was probably a little bit too much for the end of the podcast, but
I think it's
another one sometime.
No, I think it's absolutely fascinating. I am so thankful that you are willing to be so open about the entire experience and talk about the things that a lot of people are not comfortable talking about, because you really are going to be able to help a lot of people as they transition, family members that are trying to find out more. And, most of our audience, like I shared, is employers that are really trying to get DEI and be right. And they don't have access to people like you who can really answer these maybe harder questions and give the insight that very few people really are open about. So thank you. I very much appreciate it. I do hope you'll come back, because I think there's a couple of things we haven't really talked about that everyone are very eager to discuss.
Yeah, I'd love to come back. And I just want to thank you, Angela, for having me today, and the rest of the team at This Way Global. And, and for everybody in the audience today, thank you for showing up. Thank you for, participating. And if you want to continue the conversation, you can find me on social media, on LinkedIn at Natalie J. Egan. You can also find me on Instagram at Natalie J. Egan. So it's my first name, Natalie, my middle initial J, and then my last name, Egan, which is EGAN, on Instagram. And then also you can find out more about my company, Translator, at translator.company. So www.translator.company. It's COMPANY. So the whole word is spelled out, translator.company. And, love to get your feedback on our product as well. So thank you so much, Angela, for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Natalie.